Welcome to this tutorial on slicing sequences in Python. It's the second of 3 tutorials on sequences. So here's what you'll learn during the tutorial. So we'll begin by looking at slicing syntax. So we'll look at the basics of how you actually slice a sequence. We'll then look at basic slicing, how you can extract a series of items. We'll look at offsetting and default values. So offsetting is when you put a negative value to go to the end of a list, and default values is where you miss out the start and the end value altogether, and they take default assumptions. We'll then look at editing lists using slicing, so how you can replace some items in a list with other items, or indeed remove them altogether. And finally, we'll look at using step values, either to take every second or third or nth item in a list or sequence, or to go backwards through it. At the top right of your screen, you'll see a link has appeared about now, which you can click on to see not only files to do with this tutorial, but also an exercise, and I'd really recommend trying the exercise to practice what you've learned. But that's enough of me. I think what I'm now going to do is hand over to my ever-capable assistant Sven while I make a well-earned cup of coffee. So I'm going to vanish. So let's get started. So I thought we'd begin with a look at the basic syntax of slicing. Don't be too worried if this puts you off a bit, because we will do lots and lots of examples. This is just to introduce the topic, really. So with any sequence, you can specify a colon in square brackets, and the bit before the colon is where you want to start extracting bits of information, be they letters or items in a tuple or list, or be they numbers in a range. And the bit after the colon is where you want to end taking information, except it's not. It's actually you put one before the end position, which can make slicing hard to get right. So let's look at a practical example. Supposing you've got the string of text wise owl and you want to extract the is, the second and the third character. Remember that a string of text is just a sequence of letters beginning at number 0. With this in mind, you could use this syntax. So you could take the string of text wise owl, you could begin at number 1, which is actually the second character in the string of text, and you could end 1 before number 3, which is 1 before the fourth character on the list, which would give you the letter S. So that would give you is. I did say it was a bit strange. The full syntax of of slicing is this. You can actually have 2 colons in the square brackets. The bit before the first colon, as I said, is where you want to start extracting information. And the bit after the first colon is, as I said, one before where you want to end extracting information. The third argument is the number of items you want to skip each time. Now normally this defaults to 1, so you can omit it basically, but sometimes it can be useful. As an example, supposing we now want to pick out every second character from the string of text wise owl to give IEOL. You could do this, remembering that a string of text is just a sequence of letters beginning at number 0, by using this syntax. Take the string of text wise owl, begin at number 1, which is actually the second letter in the sequence, I, stop 1 letter before what's a position number 8, well, there isn't a position number 8, so we'll stop at the end, and pick out every second character. So that's the syntax of slicing. I think it's way overdue to do some examples of this. So what we're going to do is start with some simple slicing. There's a file on which you can get to by clicking on the link at the top right of your screen called basedata.py, which contains a useful list of numbers, a useful list of films in this case, my 12 favourite as it happens. You may disagree with them, and a useful string of text. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of that data by pressing Ctrl-A. I'm going to copy it to the clipboard by pressing Ctrl-C. And then what I'll do is create a new file, which I'll call simple slicing. .py, and we'll paste those in. You can use different text and lists if you like. The principle will be the same. So let's start by listing out the first 5 numbers. So what I'm going to do is loop over them. So I'll create a variable called num to refer to each one in turn. And what I now need to do is from the range of the first 20 numbers, I need to pick out the first 5. To do that, I can begin at the first item in the list, and then I want to keep going to pick out the first 5. If you look at my reference point up here, the first 5 numbers will take me up to, but not including, the one which is indexed as number 5. Now, if that sounds difficult to remember, I'd agree with you. There's a much easier way to do it. I wanted to pick out the first 5 numbers, so I wanted 5 elements in my list. And the trick is to have a look at the difference between the start number and the end number, and just make sure that comes to the right total. So 5 minus 0 is 5. So I'm going to print out each number, and if I now run that code, you can see it gives me the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the next thing we're going to do is to print out the first, let's say the first 3 films, excluding the first one. So I would aim to get The Matrix, The Parent Trap, and The Sound of Music. You'll notice I've got a slight preference for musicals, by the way. So what we'll do is print out first 3 films, excluding the first. Comments are so good, not just at explaining to other people what you're doing, but at getting you to think through in your head what you're trying to achieve. So to do this, I can say for each film in the list of films, or rather the tuple of films actually, which begins not on the first item but on the second one, which of course will be 1 because they're numbered from 0. And remember my tip, I want 3 films, so I can just think, well, I'm going to put 4 there, because 4 minus 1 is 3, without necessarily thinking too much about it. So for each of those films, I'll just print out its name. Run that code. You should see it gives me a list of those films. So let's try one more example. What we're going to do now is we're going to print out the last 7 words in my quotation. Now, there's better ways to do this than what I'm about to show you, but we haven't learned them yet. We will in the rest of this tutorial, by the way. So what I'm going to do is create a variable called words, which will hold a list of all the words. So if you remember, I can use the split function to do that. What I then want to do is find how many words there are. So I'm going to create another variable called number words, and I'm going to set that to equal to the length of the words list. The length function just returns the number of items in a list. And just before I continue, I want to convince you that this is working. So what I'll do is I'll set a breakpoint to the left of that line, and I'll debug this by pressing the F5 key or by choosing Start Debugging. And what you'll see is it pauses at that line. And if I let my mouse linger over the words variable, you can see it contains a list of all the words in the quotation. So it's a nice way of seeing that the split function really does work. And what I'll then do is stop debugging and remove my breakpoint as well. So what I can now do is loop over those words. So I can say for word in words, but of course I don't want to loop over all of them. So what I'll do is I'll begin 7 before the end. So to do that, I can put my starting points as number words minus 7. And using my previous tactic of working out that the number of words I want is 7, the thing I type in here must be just number words. As I say, there's a much better way to do this coming up. For each of those words, I can print it out. What I'll do is just comment out some of my previous lines so I can actually see the output. And if I hold Control-N to run that, you can see that it says no one left to speak for me, which are the last 7 words of my quotation. What I want to do now is to muddy the waters a bit, or perhaps make them clearer. You decide. I'll just comment out those 2 previous lines of code. I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to print out the last 7 words, but better. So to do that, I can repeat my line for word in words. And the index number I want to start at is 7 from the end. If you just put a negative number in as part of the slicing, it will assume that that is offset from the end of your, in this case, my tuple, but it could equally well be from whatever sequence I'm working with. And that's brilliant. But I now have a problem. I want to end just before the end. I want to end on the last word. If you could imagine at the end of my string of text that there is an extra endpoint where my cursor is showing there, I want to end just before that. So I really want to type in a number here which says the last item in the sequence. But can I show you the two alternatives I've got open to me? Neither of them will work. If I put -1, which is the closest I can get to the end, and print that out, it almost works. But when I run the code, you can see I miss out the last word, me. I just get no one left to speak for. And that's because slicing goes from the first item to just before the last one. -1 is one item inset or offset from the end of the list, or tuple. And so one item before that will actually give me 4. So the alternative to that, I guess, would be to go to 0, but that will actually give me nothing at all. So if I run that, you'll see I just get nothing. And the reason for that is slicing by default goes forwards. So I'm going forward from 7 items before the end to the first item in the list, which is number 0. And don't forget I said I was going forward. There's nothing if I go forward between those two, and that's why this doesn't print anything out. So it looks like I've just shown you a new tool, offsetting, and then showed you that it's actually useless. But there's a solution which is really nice. When you're slicing, the bit before the colon, by default, if you don't specify it, will be assumed to be 0, the first item in the sequence. And the bit after the colon, by default, will be assumed to be 1 after the last item in the sequence. And that's exactly what I want to do. So if I just miss out that last argument, I will begin 7 words before the end of my sequence, and I'll stop 1 word before it finishes. So if I run that, I will get no one left to speak for me. So let's do a couple more examples of that, because it's clearly very useful. So let's print out the first 5 numbers again. I could have done that by saying for, let's call it num, because the previous one is commented out. I can take my integers, range, and I can miss out the start point altogether, which will default to 0, and put my endpoint in as 5. I still need to specify that. You'll notice it's beginning to get a bit harder to read with all my colons and square brackets. And if I print out that number, and then if I run that code, you can see it gives me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we'll do a couple more examples. Let's do one more. I'll just comment those lines of code out. So we'll do one more example. Let's print out all of the films. So to do that, I can say for film in films. And what I'm going to do with this list is specify that the start value will default to 0 and the end value will default to 1 after the last item. You'll notice there's no difference whatsoever between that and just putting the word films in. They both refer to every single item in the sequence. And then I can print out the film. Try to type that in correctly. And then if I run that, you'll see I get every single film from beginning to end. So that's how you can set offsetting. Negative numbers are assumed to be offset from the end of the sequence and not the beginning. And how you can use default values. The first item after the square bracket defaults to number 0, the first item in the sequence. And the second thing after the colon defaults to 1 after the last item in the sequence. So I want to look now at editing lists, and I want to start by correcting an embarrassing mistake I made. So I've written La La Land like that, but I think that's referring to the Teletubby and not the city of Los Angeles, so I'm going to change it. To do that, I can refer to the item in my list, which is number, let's see, 0, 1, 2, 3, number 4, and make a change to it. And if you have reservations in the back of your mind about whether this is going to work, they're actually entirely justified, as we'll see. So if I change this to La La Land, spelled correctly. Incidentally, I've put this in a new file called editinglist.py and just copied in my list of my top 12 films. So if I put that, and then if I try printing out my results, my film sequence, and then if I try running that, what you'll see is it says tuple object does not support item assignment. So I could have guessed this really because this is a tuple, because I've used round brackets. Tuples are immutable. You can't make changes to them. And so I won't be able to modify my sequence. I could get around this by changing these round brackets to square brackets, or I could use the list function to convert my sequence to a list. I'm going to cheat. I'm going to use the easy option, which is just to change this into a list. And with that single change, when I run my code, it will work. And you can see it's corrected it. So effectively the fifth item in the list is now La La Land with only one A in each word. You can also use slicing to remove items from a list altogether, which is quite clever. So what I'm going to do, I'll just move that down a bit. And I'm going to remove the last two items. To do this, I can specify my list. And what I can do is beginning two items before the end and ending at the end. So I'll miss out my second bit of the slice altogether to ensure that I run all the way to the end of the sequence. I can set that list, which currently holds A Few Good Men and Casablanca, I can set that to be an empty string or an empty list. And the way you can do that is by putting two square brackets like that. It's a long time since I saw a Casablanca anyway. If I now run that code, you can see I stop at Die Hard. It's omitted the last two items. So it's a really clever way to remove items from a list. I'll just show you one more thing on this topic, which is how you can join lists together using slicing as well. So what I'm going to do is create a new list which contains the first two films, Cabaret and The Matrix, and the last two films, which will now be 12 Angry Men and Die Hard, because I've removed the last two items. To do this, I'm going to create a new variable, which I'll call best and worst. And I'll set it equal to, well, let's start with the first two films. To get the first two films, I can miss out the first argument altogether because I know I want to start at the beginning. And for the second one, I can put 2 because I want to stop one before the second item. I can then use a plus, and what the plus will do is just add on more items to my list. The items I want to add will take the list, begin 2 items before the end, and run all the way to the end. So you can see how I'm using my default values to make my sequences easier to write and read. Then go down and change this. The best and worst, and try running that. You can see that it gives me the first 2 items and the last 2 items in my list. The last thing I want to cover in this tutorial is the step value. I don't know if you remember at the beginning of this tutorial, I said that there were possibly 3 arguments you could specify for slicing. The bit before the first colon is the start position in the sequence. The bit after it is one before the end position. But there's a third bit, which is the number of items to skip each time. And that's what we're going to look at now. So I've created another version of my data called stepvalues.py, and I'm going to use this to illustrate step values. So the first thing we're going to do is pick out all the even numbers, a nice easy thing to start with. So to do that, I can say for each variable, let's got num in my range of values. But rather than choosing all the values, I'm going to start with the second one, which is a number 2. And I'm going to keep going until the end. And I'm going to print out every second one. So that extraordinarily concise notation will print out all the even numbers. So if I just test that out by actually printing out a value, and if I try running that, it gives me the even numbers. I'll just print that out. Let's try another example. Let's print out every 5th film. So to do this, I'm just going to put a single command in this time. I'll refer to the film's tuple. I'll start at the beginning. I'll keep going to the end, but I'll only print out every 5th value. And I reckon this will give me Cabaret, The Prestige, and A Few Good Men. Let's see if it does. So if I print that out, that's what I get. So missing values is relatively easy to understand. It can get a bit complicated when you go backwards. What I'm going to do is show the first 10 letters of this quotation backwards. Quite why? I'm not quite sure, but it illustrates slicing. So the first thing I'll do is create a variable, which I'll call start, to hold the first 10 letters of the quotation. To do that, I'll start at the beginning, and I'll stop one character before the 11th item. What I can then do is print that out backwards. So to do this, I can print out this variable. I can begin at the end character, which is offset 1 from the character just beyond the end. I can stop at the beginning, so I'll miss that out. And I can go back 1 character at a time. If I run that, you'll see it gives me the first 10 characters backwards. And that's pretty much the end of what you can do with slicing. But as I hope you'll agree, your examples can get quite complicated. If you want one last thing to blow your mind, consider this example. This is perfectly valid Python. It would probably be better done in several different stages. What this will do is take the quotation of text above, split it into all its different words, so this will return a list of individual words. Take the 6th word in the list, because everything's numbered from 0, so that will give me this word here. And then starting at the character 1 before the end and going all the way back to the beginning, it will print them out in reverse order. So I reckon when I run this, I will get the word socialists, but in reverse order. So let's see as a final thing whether that's what actually happens if I run that. And I think that's the word socialists in reverse order.